Hello! In this video, I'm going to do a walkthrough of my how to build a WebSocket multi-client chat using Ionic and Node.js. So I have a blog post about this, which I put up a few weeks ago, and it's been quite popular, so I thought I'd make a video out of it. So basically, what I do in the post is I go through each step of how to build a multi-client chat system using Ionic as the client, the front end. So Ionic is a hybrid mobile app development framework which is based on AngularJS, and it allows you to build hybrid apps that run on Android, iOS and Windows phones very easily, all in JavaScript and HTML. So that's the client side, and the backend is a very basic Node.js server, or a very basic server that runs in Node.js that simply accepts connections, multiple connections from the client, and uses WebSockets to send the messages between the clients. So I'm not gonna go through each step of actually creating it, because I've already done that, and the code is available on GitHub, and all the source code and each step-by-step instruction is available on the blog post, which I'll link in the video notes. But what I'm going to go through is how to get the project up and running, the project that I put on GitHub, how to get the applications up and running, and I'm going to walk through, step through the code, so I'll show you exactly what's going on and explain what's happening there. So if you want a text version with all the code that you can actually copy and see all the commands, and head over to my blog, londonappdeveloper.com, and then you can find how to build a WebSocket client, WebSocket multi-client chat using Ionic and Node.js. And I'll also put that link in the video notes. So all the code is on here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clone the Git repositories. So there's a client app and a server app. Both of them are available on my GitHub. So if you go to GitHub, and then you have here tutorial multi-chat client and tutorial multi-chat server. So we want to open both of these up. I'm going to open them in tabs here. So you can have a look at the code here. You can see that the project's there. I'll populate the README with some links and stuff with some more details later on, but for now let's clone this project to our local machine. So we're going to clone both. Let's start with the chat client. So I'm going to open up my terminal. I'll just take a moment to mention that I'm using Ubuntu Linux here as my operating system. This will work on any operating system from Windows, Mac OS and Linux. All the tools that I use are available for all of those platforms, and they're very easy to install. So there's, just because I'm using Linux, it doesn't mean that you won't be able to use this on your Mac or your PC. You just need to install all the prerequisites, which are listed here on the setting up your system part of the blog post. So let's start by cloning the repository. So I'm gonna cd. So open up your terminal or your command prompt or whatever window, and we're gonna change to a location where we can have a workspace. So I'm gonna put it in workspace / WebSocket tutorial. And the first thing I'm gonna do is clone the server. So I'm gonna go to GitHub, clone or download, and then git clone the server. And while that's working, I'm going to open up another terminal. I'm going to go to the same directory, and right alongside the server, I am going to clone the client side, or the client app. Okay, so once that's done, we can move on to the next step, which is to run npm install on the application. So I'll start with the client. So if you go to your terminal or one of your terminal windows, and you do cd / tutorial multi-chat client, we're going to run npm install. Okay, so that's going to install all of the requirements for our project. If you got an error when you typed npm install saying that the command npm was not found, then that's because you haven't got npm or no package manager installed. You can install that using the instructions that I have put on the blog post. So you've got to head over to Node.js.org, and then the instructions are on their site to download the latest version. Once you install Node.js, you will also have the Node package manager installed as well. Okay, so now that the requirements for that have installed, I'm going to do the same on my server. npm install. I'm just going to open up my text editor on the client. Actually, I'll do it on the. We'll start with the server project. So open up my Atom editor for the server project. So here's the code for the server. The server's very simple. It's a very simple server. It's only a few lines, and that's one of the powerful things about Node.js is that you can, in just a few lines, do some pretty incredible things. So the package.json file is just the npm configuration. Basically, it tells it what dependencies to install. You can see that this one only has one dependency, which is WS. WS is the WebSocket package that we're using with Node.js. This is just the basic details of the project, so we can close that. The main code that we're running is in this index.js file. So the application itself is only one file. It's just all the code that I've written is in this index.js file. And let's just walk through this file and explain exactly what's going on here. So the first thing we're doing is we're creating this variable WebSocket server, and we're requiring WS, which is the library that we're using, the npm WebSocket package that we're using, the one that was referenced in the package.json file. And this is what's been installed when we typed npm install. So when you type npm install in a project, it goes into the package.json and it looks at the dependencies, and it will install the dependencies that are listed there. So we only have one, so it's quite quick. We go back to our index.js. So this includes the WebSocket server, or the WebSocket library there. And the next step is to create a new WebSocket server, a new server object and pass it the parameters port 7007. So this is going to run a server listening on port 7007. So it's basically going to listen for WebSocket connections on that port. So this is what we're going to need later for the client. When we go to configure the client, we're going to need to remember what the port was. And this is just a console log to output that the server's running, just so we know something's happening. Otherwise, it's just a blank screen that doesn't output anything. And the next thing here, this WSS broadcast. So WSS is referencing our WebSocket server here. And it's basically setting .broadcast to the function broadcast message. So this is whenever we call .broadcast on our WebSocket server, this is the function that it's going to call. So we're configuring that function here. And that function is going to take a single parameter message, or a single argument, I should say. And what it's going to do is it's going to loop through all of the clients. So it's got this for each client function. So do the JavaScript for each call on the list. So it's an array. It's going to loop through each of the clients, and it is going to send the message. So it's going to run client.send. So .send is a function that's built into the client that's created by the WebSocket server. So that's already there. So this basically just sends the message to the client. The next bit down here is the listener for listening on a connect for listening for a new connection. So this is basically every time we receive a new connection, it's going to run this function here, and it's going to pass it the WebSocket here. So basically, so this is the WebSocket of the connecting client. So when we receive a connection, it's going to set this variable to the remote IP, and this is just so we can log the remote IP to the screen, because it's nice to see which when we're testing it, we can see which clients have connected. So what it's doing is it's running this function when a connection is received, and it's adding a listener to listen for message events. So listen for any time a message is received, and then it's telling it to call this function when a message is received. So as part of this is a reference to our function that we created here, wss.broadcast, and it's basically saying when we receive a message on message, broadcast the message. So when it receives a message, take the message and broadcast it out to everyone. So it broadcasts it out to all the other connected clients, basically. So that's our server. It's a very, very simple server, and part of the inspiration for writing this tutorial and this video is because when I first started programming, something I was really fascinated with was these creating chat client server applications and kind of network connected programming. And I used to do it in VB6, which was a lot different to this. It used to take me hours and hours and like hundreds of lines of code, it seemed, to get something like this working. Whereas when I discovered that you could just do this in Node.js in a few lines, I was pretty impressed. So that was part of the inspiration. But that's our server. So our server's all set up, and the second part is the client side code. So I'm just gonna what I'll do is I'll add the client to my Atom project here. WebSocket tutorial client. Okay, so the client is a Ionic app, and Ionic comes with a command line interface that basically will create template projects for you really quickly, because when you create Angular projects and you create these new web frameworks, there's a lot of imports and a lot of kind of different files that need to be configured, and Ionic uses a bunch of different technologies, such as Gulp and NPM and all these things. So, and Bower. So basically, they have a pretty decent CLI, which a command line interface, which allows you to just type commands and then it creates all of these things for you. So you don't have to go through the tedious task of creating all of these files and configuring it. Because if you look at the package.json file, there's quite a lot of more packages that are required for this than there is for the server project. So I explained in the text tutorial how to set this up from scratch. So if you're interested in doing this, like learning how to do this from scratch and using the Ionic command line interface and everything, then go over to the blog and just follow that through, and then maybe watch this video after, and it will give you some more idea, give you a more in-depth understanding of how it's all working. But I'm just going to go through the client-side code. So I've kept it really simple here. I literally just have one HTML file, which is the index HTML file, which a lot of this is created automatically with the Ionic new project command. So it's just a HTML document, and I've only used I haven't added any of my own kind of elements or custom styling or anything. Everything that I use is part of the Ionic framework, part of the Ionic kind of elements that they give you. So you'll see that in a minute when we run the project. But so most of this here at the top is all default stuff that's created by Ionic. And here you have the Ion pane, which is what's going to hold our code, or it holds the view. So we have a header here. It just says a chat client app. So this just puts it in the header bar at the top of the app, which we'll show you in a bit. And then what we have next is the section for inputting the name. So what I've done, just to keep it simple, I've just put one page, and on that one page you have the name input and the chat text, and you basically toggle between the two depending on which stage you are in the in using the app. What you might do if you were to make a real app out of this, or you were wanting to make your own project, then what you would do is you would probably create two separate screens, two separate web pages for those two things, for inputting the name and the chat screen. But just to keep it simple, I've just created one. And what I've done is I've used this ng show. So this is an Angular attribute that you can add onto. It's part of the Angular framework that you can add onto any element, any HTML element, and it toggles the element's view based on a variable in our controller. So in Angular, you have your HTML file, your view files. And then you have your controllers, so that's all HTML, that's all the display, and then you have your controllers, which are the logic, the JavaScript logic behind. So the way that you can, there's certain attributes that allow you to bind different variables in the logic, in the JavaScript logic, to the view page or the HTML. So that's really what Angular is all about. So this ng show is one of the ways that you can bind a variable in the JavaScript to the HTML. So what this actually does is it says show if this variable, which we'll create, I'll show you soon in the controller, is truthy. I think that's the word. So basically, if this is undefined or false or null, then this won't show. If it is true, or it has a string, or it's a truthy variable, then it will show. So that's what this ng show does. So basically, if we have show name input is set to true, or is set to anything that isn't undefined or false or null, then it will show this whole section. So it's wrapped around this whole section, which is the input name section. And here we have, so that allows us to toggle from the app, from the JavaScript, allows us to toggle this view based on where the user is in the application flow. So it basically just has a prompt to enter name, and then it has a text input, which is bound using ng model to the username variable. So ng model, another one of those awesome Angular attributes, binds a value of an element to a variable in the JavaScript. So this will mean that in our scope variable for username, we'll have whatever value is in this input field is going to be linked, or is going to be bound to that variable. So it works both ways. So if we, in our JavaScript, if we add some or change the username, then it will change the username in the view. Or if we, in the view, in the input field, we change the username, then it will change the username variable in the JavaScript. So that's a really useful way to kind of share the value between the view and the logic, backend logic, or the controller logic. So I'll show you this in the JavaScript after or next. So that's the name input section, and then there's this button in submit name. So what this does is has another one of those Angular attributes, ng click, and this is an on click event. So what it will do is it will just call this function on click, and you can actually pass scope variables that are defined elsewhere in the template into these functions, which is really useful because you can basically call a function in our controller called submitName, and you can pass it the username or whatever they've entered in the username, and then it just has the text join chat. So that's the kind of first step in our app. The second step is the chat screen. So once they've joined the chat, you get to see the chat screen, and this again has that ng show toggle with show chat screen. So this again, it will ng shows the Angular attribute. If this is true or a truthy value, then it will show this screen. If it is false or an undefined or a null, then it will not show this screen or this section of the screen. So once this is set to true, it will show our chat screen, and it will start at the top with a chatting as and then your username. So again, this is kind of like the ng model, where we bound the ng model to this input here, but instead it just outputs the text. So it's a one-way binding. It's a single binding that says whatever's in the JavaScript, whatever's in that JavaScript variable, output it on the screen, and then when it changes, it automatically refreshes and it will instantaneously change. So that's how that works. And then down here we have this is where the chat box, the actual chat box is. So in this text area, we have a chat box, and these comments here, by the way, I explain everything that happens here. So I've gone overkill on the comments just to explain what's happening, so you can actually just read through the code and understand without having to listen to me talk or read the thing. But sometimes it's nice to have it explained to understand what's going on. But this text area here is the chat, the actual chat box where the messages will go. So it's a text area because it's a multi-line text area. If you just have an input, then it's just a single line. Text area is a multi-line. And I've given it an ID. The reason I gave it an ID, as I explained in the comments here, is because with a chat, you want to see the latest message at the bottom, and you want it to automatically scroll to the bottom of the chat. You don't want to have to, when there's new messages, scroll down to read them. You want it to automatically do that. So the simplest way for me to do that was to reference it using this this ID. I'm pretty sure there's a better way of doing that, but just for the sake of simplicity and keeping it simple, I just did it with a standard ID reference. And again, this binds to the ng model, uses an ng model attribute to bind the contents of the text area to message log, the message log variable. And I've put this style here, resize none, to prevent the users being able to drag and change the size. It's kind of a new thing that came in Chrome in the last few years, is that you can actually resize these text boxes, but we don't want them to do that because when they're tapping on the screen, it messes up the view. Here I've set the rows to 10, so it's a 10 row chat. I just basically eyed that to see how it fit, and I made it read only. We don't want them to be able to enter text into the chat window. It's just they can read text in this window. For entering text, you have this section down here, which is the input with an ng model of message, and when you click the button, it calls send message, the message, and it sets the message as empty. This logic should probably be done in the controller, but I've done it here just to show that you can actually do multiple things with these attributes, with this ng click attribute, which is quite cool. Okay, so that's the view side. So now let's go into the JavaScript side. I just want to keep them both open side by side. Okay, so on this side here, the app.js file, you have your JavaScript, and this side you have the index.html file, which is the HTML file I just went through. So I wanted to open them up side by side so I can link what's happening in the controller to what's happening in the index.html file. So as I said, most of this was auto-generated by, or this top part here was auto-generated by Ionic. So this is automatically created when you use your starter project, and it basically just defines and sets up our Angular project to run using the Ionic framework or the Ionic module. Okay, so this is the code that we added. So this is the controller. And our controller is called main controller. And something I didn't explain the first time is on your body you set the name of the controller to the controller, the name of the controller that you're going to define with the JavaScript that's going to run the logic behind the page. If that makes sense. So here you have our ng controller. You set it to main controller, and here we have our main controller. So it basically says this HTML, everything in this template is going to be controlled, or it's going to be managed. The logic is going to be in our main controller CTRL. So our controller, we import the scope, or we inject the scope and the document objects. And what I do is the first thing we do is output a log to say that it's loaded. I just like to do that so I know that my controller has been loaded correctly. This next bit here is the server URL. So if you remember, if we go back to the server, the index.js file in the server, when we created our server, we created with a port 7007. So this needs to match this number. And localhost is saying connect to the server on our local machine. So we're going to run the server locally. You could run the server on another you could run the server on another machine, and then you would put the IP address or the domain name of that machine to connect to it. It basically says the URL is at WebSocket/localhost on our local machine and running on port number 7007. So that's the server URL. The next is the WebSocket variable. It's just an empty variable. It's going to hold our WebSocket when we create that when the user connects. So it'll come down here, and you've got our scope variables. So this is our scope variable for show name input. So when the controller first loads, we're going to set our scope variable for show name input to true. So if you remember, we used that in the template. I'll show you here where we have the ng show attribute that links it to this show name. So this scope variable show name input. So if this is true, then this is going to be displayed, and you're going to see this on the screen. So when we start the app, we want it to start at the enter name page. So we set that to true to start at the enter name page. And this is the chat screen. So before they enter the name, they don't get to see the chat. So that's going to be false. And that means that this, where it references ng show chat screen, isn't going to be displayed. So you're not going to see this when you first load the app. And then we're going to do a couple more things here where we're going to set the message log as a blank string, and we're going to set the username as a blank string just to make sure the inputs are empty when the user loads the page. And here we have a function that this is kind of the setup phase, so the setup stuff that we run when we first load the app. Now we have some functions that we're going to use in the client side when we're working with the app. So the first one is a toggle screens. So this simply, it could be a bit confusing if you're not used to this kind of syntax, but this toggles both the show name input and the show chat screen. So basically it sets this to whatever it isn't, if that makes sense. So if this is true, then it's going to say equals not this, which is going to be false. So all it's going to do is toggle these variables. So it's going to set this to, if this is already true, then it's going to be false. If this is already false, it's going to be true. And the same for this one. So whatever this is after you call this function, it's going to change to the opposite. So if you see that we set this as true and false on our page when we start, so it's basically just going to swap those around each time you run this toggle screens. So that's just the way I am handling the toggling of the screens. You could improve this. You could just make it one variable here and then change it in the template to say to check for the opposite. But I just wanted to make it very clear and simple. But as I said, if you were doing a real app and you're doing this in the real world, and it wasn't just a kind of tutorial demo, then you would actually create two different views for each one of these screens and navigate between them. But that's kind of out the scope of this tutorial. So the next function is connect. So this is going to connect to the server. So this basically says create a new WebSocket and take the server URL and create a new WebSocket with that and assign it to WS, which is what we defined here. The reason we put it here is so that it can be accessed outside this function. So once we call this function, it's going to assign this. If we didn't do this and we just created it here, then you would only be able to use this web service variable inside the function. But you probably already know that. So I'll continue. So this basically is the connect function. So what this does is it creates a WebSocket, and then it assigns some other functions to the WebSocket function. So it basically says on message. So when the WebSocket calls on message, which is when it receives a message, it's going to call this handle message received, which is a function we define below. And here on open, this is when you connect. When we connect to the server, it's going to call handle connected, which is again here below. And then when there's an error, it's going to call handle error. So if there's an error happens, then it calls this function here. So that's what these three functions are. So handle message, which is going to be called when a message is received. basically calls this log message function, which is defined below, and the log message function just takes the data that's been received and it will just add it to the message log. Handle connected is what happens when we are connected to the server. So what this is going to do is going to create a new string which includes connected to the server and then the URL which we are connected to, and it's going to log this on the message. Just remember to put my semicolons. So this handle connected is simply going to just add a log to the message to say that we've connected to the server, just for information purposes. And the next one is going to be for handling errors. So this is simply going to output the error that is handled to the console. So if there's an error, it's just going to put it out to the console. This is just for the development of it. In the real world, you'd probably output this to the screen in a nice way and say, sorry, unable to connect, or there is a connection error, or you've been disconnected, or something like that. But for now, we're just going to output it to the screen, or output it to the console. The next function is the log message. So that's the one that's called when a message is received and when we are connected. So all this does is it will call this scope.apply, because this ensures that the message is that all the elements on the page are updating. Normally you don't need to do this, but we need to do this because of the scrolling update. So typically anything you change in the scope variable will automatically be reflected in Angular on the client side. But because we're doing some magic here with jQuery and we're changing the making sure that they're always scrolled to the bottom, we have to call this scope.apply to make sure that the page content is refreshed. So when log message is called, this will set the message log to the message log, because we don't want to delete the old messages, we just want to append a new message. So it's going to assign the message, whatever's already in the message log, to the message log, plus the message, plus a line break. So this /n here is a new line. It means a new line. So this will add a line break, so then when the next message comes in, it comes in on the line below. So you got new messages coming in on their own lines. And then we're going to call this update scrolling function. So as it says here, this is not really best practice in the real app. Correct that spelling error. In the real app, you would put this logic all in a directive. Directive is an Angular element that you can create a custom element. Again, out the scope of this specific tutorial, but you might want to look into that if you're thinking about making your own real-time chat application using WebSockets. But yeah, for this tutorial, I simply get the message ID and I use standard jQuery to scroll top equals scroll height, so it will scroll down. Okay, and now we're onto these scope functions. So these functions are just standard functions which can be called within our controller. These functions are assigned to a scope variable. So these basically can be called by the template file. So that's because we have the submitName, which we call here in this ng-click. In order for it to be accessible in the template, in order for the controller function to be accessible in the template, you have to assign it as a scope function. So that's what we do here. We have the submitName function, and we take the name, and if they left it blank, we just return and don't do anything. Again, another nice addition to this app could be that it validates the name and it actually displays a message to the user to say, sorry, please enter a name. But for simplicity, I just kept it, basically it does nothing unless you enter a name. And then what it will do is it will set the scope variable username to equal the name that they entered. And then we will connect to the actually this is incorrect. This doesn't need to be there, because if anyone who spotted that, well done, because this it's already bound. The name that they entered is already bound to the username field, so you don't really need to do this because it's already there. So we simply change that to that. And then we call the connect function. So you connect, it then calls the connect function, which we defined up here, which will connect to our server, connect to our WebSocket, and then it will set up the connection, and then we'll toggle the screen. So when they click submit name, if it gets past this step, then it connects and it toggles the screen so that it will hide the enter name page and it will show the chat log page. And then we can send messages. So down here we have send message. The scope function send message. This will get called, and this will call with a message, and it will append the message. Or sorry, no, it will append the name to the message, and then it will send the message to the WebSocket. So this WebSocket.send will be called, and it will send the message, and then our server will send the message to everyone else, including the person who sent it. So we don't need to add the message to the log ourselves here, because it will be added automatically when the message bounces back and is received again. And then this handle message received is called, and the message is put into the box. So you know that if the message appears in the box, that message has been sent to the server, guaranteed, because it's come back to be added to the box. Okay, so that's the main changes to the, or there, I think the only changes to the Angular project that we need to make for the app to work. So now for the fun part, let's actually show us the app in action. So if you've just cloned the projects in GitHub, so if you've just cloned them to your local machine, then I'm gonna show you how to run the projects. You should be able to just clone them and run them straight away. You don't need to make any changes to them for it to work. And then you can maybe build some extra features on them or whatever you feel like doing after. But let's get this up and running. So I'm just going to minimize the window. So the first thing I'm going to do is start the server. So it's a Node.js server. So the way that you start it is you simply run node and then index file. So if you remember, we said that we output it to the log, that when the server's running, that's the log output right there. So you can see that. I'm going to open a new terminal window here so we can have them side by side. So this is the server, the new WebSocket tutorial. And now we're going to go to the client. Oops. Got a new keyboard, so it's a lot quieter, but I need to learn how to use it. So this is our client, and the client, to run this, we need to type Ionic serve. So if you type Ionic serve and you get an error saying Ionic is not found, then you need to install Ionic. You need to install the Ionic globally. So I explain how to do this in the tutorial on the website, the blog post. But in case you don't know how to, or in case you didn't do it yet, then it's very simple. You simply type npm-g for global install Ionic, and it will install Ionic globally. So it looks like it's doing that now, even though I have it installed already. It's probably going to update it to the latest version. But once you've got Ionic installed, you can then run the Ionic CLI commands. So again, if you follow the tutorial, then you would have already installed it. If you just cloned the projects from GitHub, then it may not be installed. Let's let that run. So I'm going to close that off because that can take quite a while and I already have it installed. But if you don't already have it installed, then just let that run and complete. So to run the project, I'm going to type Ionic serve. And look, it's it literally starts a local server to run our web app, and it pops up a browser to display the actual app, which is great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate this working. So I'm actually going to open the developer tools. So if you go to more tools, developer tools, you can change the view to simulate an app. So by clicking this toggle device toolbar, and you can actually change the device. So I'm going to make it an iPhone 5 because it's a nice size. You can refresh, and then I'm going to load 2 of them up to demonstrate this working. So to load 2, it's literally running a web server that's pointing to this URL. So if you just copy this, you open it in a new tab, and then you want to also set this as iPhone. Actually, let's set it as a Nexus. I like Nexus. So we've got a Nexus here, and we've got our iPhone here, and so it's currently prompting us for the name. That's the first thing I asked for. So we're going to type the name, Mark, and we're going to join chat. And you can see that it says chatting as Mark, and it's connected to connected to the server. If we go back to our Node.js server here, you can see that it's received a connection from 127.0.0.1, which is the same as localhost. That's the kind of local IP address that's on every computer in the world. And then in this one, we'll chat as Brooke, and then we'll click join chat, and you can see that this is join the chat, and we've got another connection, and then we can type messages here. Hello. Okay, we did need that message. We did need that to be set. Yes, we do need this username to be set. So let's put that back, and then go back to the page, and then refresh. We'll try that again. Forget about that mistake, it's late. So I'm going to chat as one as Mark, I'm going to chat as one as Brooke, and we'll type hello, and there you go, Mark, hello, hey. Okay, cool. So that's the how to make a or that's the walkthrough of the code for how to make a WebSocket multi-chat client system. So you can actually create you could create clients in anything that supports WebSocket. So you could create them in a Java app, or you could create them in a website, or you can create them wherever, and you connect them to your Node.js WebSocket server, and there you have a chat system. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear anyone's thoughts, or anything that they any kind of things that they create with this technology. I'm always interested to hear that, so please feel free to leave it in the comments or send it over. Thank you for watching, and yeah, if you have any questions, just leave it in the comments, and I'll try and get to them. Thanks for watching. Bye.